Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place at the very edge of Imperial space, past the last navigational beacons, past the last listening posts, past the last brave or foolish souls willing to press their ships into the unknown dark, where the stars themselves seem wrong, where constellations form shapes that don't fit comfortably in the human mind, where light arrives from directions it shouldn't, and the silence between worlds carries a weight that feels conscious, like something vast and patient is watching from the deep. This region of space is called the Ghoul Stars, and out there, standing between that howling dark and the rest of the galaxy, are the Death Specters. You might not have heard of them. That's the point, and in many ways, that's the design. Let's take a moment and just sit with the sheer scale of what it means to be a Space Marine chapter, stationed at the very edge of the known galaxy. Think about what that involves, practically and emotionally and militarily. Most chapters operate somewhere in the vast interior of Imperial space, in the densely populated and extensively mapped segmentums where supply lines exist, where neighboring worlds are inhabited by humans who wave the Imperial flag, where a call for reinforcement has some reasonable chance of being answered in a time frame measured in years rather than decades. Even the chapters that are considered frontier forces, posted on the edges of civilized space, generally have access to the broader Imperium's infrastructure in some meaningful way. Tithes of gene seed, supply convoys, the occasional crusade force passing through that can top up their numbers and materiel. The Death Specters have none of that. They are so far beyond the frontier that the frontier is a distant memory in the direction of terror. Their nearest reliable Imperial neighbors are so far away that the communication lag alone would make coordinated military response to a crisis effectively useless. They sustain themselves through means the broader Imperium doesn't fully understand, and they do it while facing threats that would cause Imperial High Command to have serious doubts about whether the situation was even survivable. They've been doing this for approximately 7,000 years. Just the two of us talking about this right now, that number should feel heavy. 7,000 years. The Horus Heresy, and the event that defines the entire 41st millennium and shapes every faction, every grudge, every piece of military doctrine in the setting, happened 10,000 years before the main timeline. The Death Specters have existed for 7/10 of that span. They predate the Space Marine chapters that most people think of as ancient. They've been at their post in the dark for so long that the wars they've fought in have no proper names anymore, just references to sectors that burned and species that were driven back, and brothers who died and were mummified and placed in the catacombs under a fortress built on a world of graves. In a setting as enormous and richly populated as Warhammer 40,000, there are hundreds of Space Marine chapters. Some of them are famous: the Ultramarines, the Space Wolves, the Blood Angels. Their names echo through the lore like thunder. Entire libraries of fiction, codex entries, and supplemental material build out their histories with the kind of dense, layered detail that takes years to fully absorb. But the Death Specters are not like those chapters. They exist in the margins of the setting, mentioned in whispers rather than proclamations. Their presence in the lore is sparse in a way that feels deliberate, as though Games Workshop and the writers who have touched them are preserving something, keeping the curtain mostly drawn. And that restraint, that careful withholding of answers, is exactly what makes them one of the most compelling chapters in the entire 41st millennium. Because the little we do know about the Death Specters is extraordinary. They were born in secrecy, are founded during one of the most mysterious events in Imperial history, a founding so unusual that no reliable records were kept of it, during a period when the Imperium itself was tearing apart at the seams. Their homeworld is a place of graveyards and tomb cities, a cemetery world at the very edge of explored space, overlooking a region of the galaxy that no Imperial expedition has ever returned from. Their chapter master, every single one throughout their history, sits down on a mysterious alien throne and never stands up again. The throne slowly kills him. It drains his life away over the years until he eventually turns to stone. And nobody outside the chapter knows this is happening. Nobody outside the chapter is allowed to know. Their warriors are albino, every single one of them, pale as bleached bone, with blood-red eyes that glow in the dark corridors of their fortress. They die during their initiation ritual and come back to life using nothing but sheer force of will. Their first company, the elite of the elite, carries power scythes into battle, not swords, not axes, scythes. They are called the Wargeists, and somewhere beneath their fortress monastery, in a secret chamber called the Temple of Voices, a dying chapter master sits on a throne made of glass, slowly becoming stone, sustaining some kind of power so vast that psychers in orbit can feel it pressing against their minds, holding some terrible unknown calamity at bay. And they believe, they genuinely believe, that if he ever steps down, the Imperium is finished. Let that sit with you for a moment. This is the Death Specters. This is what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to go deep, all the way down into every layer of their lore, from the ancient catastrophe that made them necessary, to the alien artifact that defines their existence, to the prophecy that drives everything they do, and to the questions that may never get answered. Get comfortable. Let's begin. The Ghoul Stars. What lurks in the dark. To understand the Death Specters at all, you first have to understand the place they guard. The Ghoul Stars. This region sits in the far northeastern corner of Ultima Segmentum, which is itself the largest and most remote of the 5 segmentums that divide Imperial space. If you think of the Milky Way as a rough disk, and Terra is somewhere near the center, the Ghoul Stars are out there in the galactic east, past the Tau Empire, past the Damocles Gulf, to past the frontier worlds and exploration posts, in a place so far removed from the heart of the Imperium that standard communication, supply lines, and reinforcement are effectively impossible. The name itself tells you something. The Ghoul Stars. Not the Far Stars, not the Eastern Stars, not the Frontier Stars. Someone looked out at this region of space and named it after hungry, grave-robbing, undying things. And that name stuck for 10,000 years. That isn't an accident. Here's the thing about naming conventions in the Imperium. They tend toward the practical. Systems are numbered. Worlds get named after their governors, or their founding fleets, or their dominant industries. Even the darker, more evocative names in the setting usually have a traceable source. Some event or feature or association that made the name obvious. Hive worlds named for the hive spires that cover them. Death worlds named because they'll kill you if you step outside without the right equipment. The Ghoul Stars are called the Ghoul Stars because someone who saw them, someone who knew enough to name them, looked out at that region of the galaxy and the only word that fit was ghoul. A creature that haunts places of death. A thing that isn't alive in the way living things are alive, but isn't dead in the way dead things are dead. A thing that persists between those states, feeding on what has passed. That naming instinct was correct. Whatever the people who coined the name saw out there, they understood something essential about it. What makes the Ghoul Stars so remarkable and so frightening is the sheer concentration of things in there that defy easy categorization. This isn't a region that's dangerous because of orcs or chaos or even tyrannids, all of which are horrifying in well-understood ways. The Ghoul Stars are home to entities and species that fall outside the usual categories, things described in Imperial records, on the rare occasions they're mentioned at all, as supernatural. That word is chosen carefully. In a universe where psychers tear holes in reality, where gods of chaos reach through the warp to grab at mortal souls, and where ancient machine gods sleep beneath dead worlds, the word supernatural still has meaning. Things from the Ghoul Stars don't fight the way conventional enemies fight. They don't follow the rules that even the most alien of known xenospecies seem to operate under. There's something important here about the nature of fear in the 41st millennium. And most of the threats in the setting are terrifying, but they're terrifying in ways that experienced warriors can adapt to. Orcs are savage and relentless, but they have weaknesses. They have patterns. There are things that work against them. Chaos is corrupting and vast, but it follows a certain internal logic that can be studied and anticipated. Even the Tyranids, the existential dread of a hunger without end, operate according to recognizable biological imperatives. You can understand what a Tyranid organism wants because it wants what every organism wants: to feed and to spread, and to ensure the continuation of its kind. The things from the Ghoul Stars don't fit that framework. When Imperial records describe them as supernatural, they're not just reaching for dramatic language, they're admitting failure. Worse, they're saying that the usual categories don't apply, that the usual understanding doesn't hold, and that whatever these things are, they exist and operate according to rules that the Imperium hasn't figured out yet. May Nissi never figure out. Before the Age of Strife tore the galaxy apart roughly 15,000 years, before the events of the main 40,000 setting, the Ghoul Stars were actually inhabited. Human worlds existed out there. Colonists had pushed into the dark and built something, and then something unmade it. Whatever came for those worlds left behind what are now called dead worlds, planets where evidence of former human habitation exists, where the ruins are there if you dig for them, but where nothing living remains and nothing has lived for thousands of years. The scale of this extinction is genuinely staggering. With an entire frontier civilization, multiple worlds, multiple populations, gone, not conquered, not integrated, not even cleanly destroyed, just emptied. Whatever did it wasn't interested in keeping the infrastructure or converting the population. It wanted the worlds empty, and it got what it wanted. The unsettling patience in that, the absence of even the kind of wanton destruction that would leave dramatic physical evidence. The worlds didn't get scorched from orbit, or cratered by orbital bombardment, or poisoned with biological agents. They were just emptied. The buildings still stand, the infrastructure is still visible in its ruins, but every living thing was removed. That's not war. That's something closer to cleaning. Someone tidied up the Ghoul Stars, removed the biological clutter, and moved on. Among the known species that inhabit the Ghoul Stars, you have the Scythe or Fiends, an alien species that built a civilization around a gas giant called Gravecore, a world of crystal fortress cities floating in toxic cold atmosphere. Precisely what the Scythe or Fiends are in biological or cognitive terms is never made fully clear, which is part of what makes them unsettling. What is known is that no Imperial expedition had ever returned from the Ghoul Stars before High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars launched a crusade against them in 990 of the 41st Millennium. The Black Templars fought for 8 years, destroyed the outlying population centres, pushed all the way to Gravecore, and found nothing there. The Scythe of Fiends were simply gone. The entire civilization vanished. The fortress cities were empty. The platforms floating in the gas giant's atmosphere were abandoned. The Black Templars tried to destroy the world anyway, and found they couldn't. Whatever Gravecore was made of resisted Exterminatus. It resisted the combined firepower of an entire armada. Take a moment with that. Exterminatus is the Imperium's nuclear option. It's the deployment of weapons specifically engineered to destroy all life on a planetary surface, or to crack the world open entirely. Cyclonic torpedoes, life-eater virus bombs, phosphex. These are weapons that work on every material substance in the known galaxy without exception, because they work on the fundamental physics of chemistry and thermodynamics, rather than on any specific target. The Black Templars threw all of that at Gravecore, and the world shrugged it off. Whatever Gravecore is made of, whatever the Scythe or Fiends built it from or modified it with, it sits outside the operating parameters of the Imperium's most extreme weapons. When the Death Specters captain assigned to observe the crusade was asked about this, he said something chilling. He said that whatever the Imperials did to that world, it wouldn't matter in the long run. The Scythe or Fiends, he told them, always came back to reclaim their home. Always. There's the Necron Bone Kingdom of Drazak as well, a Necron dynasty operating in the Ghoul Stars distinguished by its particularly concentrated infestation of the Flayed Ones, those ancient Necrons, who are afflicted with a curse that drives them to cover themselves in the flayed skin of living creatures. The flayed ones are already one of the most disturbing enemies in the entire 40,000 setting. Genuinely grotesque in a way that goes beyond mere violence and into something that reads as madness or spiritual corruption. Drazak is home to more of them than anywhere else in known space. They congregate there, they fester there, and they are directly responsible for some of the Death Specters' most terrible campaigns. The Necron presence in the Ghoul Stars is itself noteworthy. Necrons, broadly speaking, wake up where they were buried, which means the ones in the Ghoul Stars were buried in the Ghoul Stars, which means they've been out there, dormant in their tomb worlds for 60 to 70 million years. They predate everything. They predate the Eldar. They predate human civilization. They predate the fall of the Old Ones. Whatever the Ghoul Stars were like at the time of the War in Heaven, when the Necrons were still a flesh and blood civilization, wrestling with the horror of what they were about to do to themselves. Those stars were already part of the setting in which that history played out. The Ghoul Stars don't belong to any faction's origin story. They just were. They've always been there. And the things sleeping in them have been sleeping since before anything that currently exists in the galaxy had been born. There are also things in the Ghoul Stars for which no names exist in Imperial records. Creatures described only as other kinds of nightmare. The Togaram bloodreeks, species so alien they don't translate into recognizable categories. The vague suggestions in Imperial documents of things that operate according to rules of biology and physics that shouldn't work. Was that cross the line between physical existence and something else entirely? The Ghoul Stars have been described in the simplest possible terms in some Imperial sources as somewhere no expedition ever returns from. That statement isn't exaggerated. The Black Templars were arguably the first major Imperial force in the setting's history to go in and come back out, and they managed it after 8 years of brutal fighting that cost them dearly. The fact that an entire Space Marine chapter, the Death Specters, is stationed at the border of this region alone without regular Imperial support, and has been maintaining that vigil for something like 7,000 years, is extraordinary. It says something about what they are and what they've built themselves into. Normal chapters don't do this. Normal chapters aren't capable of doing this. The Death Specters were made for exactly this purpose and nothing else. What's worth dwelling on is that the Ghoul Stars aren't just a military threat. They're a psychological one. The sense of scale, of ancient malice, of things that have been out there in the dark far longer than human civilization has existed, is part of what makes the region so oppressive in the lore. The Death Specters don't just fight an endless war against a conventional enemy. They stand watch over a void that contains things older than the Imperium, older than humanity's presence in space, and they do it alone. And they seem to believe that standing this watch is the most important thing happening anywhere in the galaxy. That level of conviction, that willingness to accept isolation, constant danger, and the slow grinding weight of a duty that never ends. This needs to come from somewhere. It comes from what the chapter knows about the Ghoul Stars that the rest of the Imperium doesn't. It comes from what happened in the 34th Millennium, during the Pale Wasting, and it comes from the Shariaks. But we'll get to both of those in time. The Pale Wasting and the Dark founding the 34th Millennium, the Nova Terra Interregnum. Even among the perpetual horrors of the far future, this period stands out as a particularly bleak stretch of Imperial history. The Council of Nova Terra, based in the Segmentum Pacificus, had declared itself an independent authority with jurisdiction over that entire segmentum, effectively splitting the Imperium in half. The political fractures that followed sent shockwaves through every system of governance the Imperium depended on, from the Administratum to the Adeptus Mechanicus, which had its own catastrophic schism called the Moirai Schism simultaneously tearing through it. The Moirai Schism divided the machine cult along doctrinal lines that had been building for centuries, splitting forge worlds and manufacturing centers between factions that refused to cooperate and sometimes actively fought each other. The Imperium was, in a very real sense, falling apart. The Moiri Schism deserves a moment of attention because its content is relevant to what followed. The schism grew out of a faction within the Adeptus Mechanicus that claimed to have developed a doctrine for reading the future in the minute fluctuations of the Astronomicon, the great psychic lighthouse that the Emperor sustains to allow navigators to guide ships through the warp. If the Astronomicon's fluctuations could be read as prophecy, then the Adeptus Mechanicus possessed not just the galaxy's greatest manufacturing and technological apparatus, but a prophetic one as well. The political implications were staggering. The doctrinal ones were enough to split the organization entirely. It was precisely during this moment of maximum vulnerability, when the Imperium's attention and military resources were stretched across a civil war of its own making and a schism in its technological foundation, that something emerged from the Ghoul Stars. The event is recorded as the Pale Wasting, and almost nothing is known about it. That's not an accident or a failure of research. The evidence was deliberately destroyed. Whatever records existed about the Pale Wasting have been censored, removed from Imperial archives, are locked away in classified repositories that require authority far above what most Imperial officials can reach, or simply burned. What little survives is fragmentary, contradictory, and written in the kind of cautious language that suggests the people doing the writing were frightened of what they were putting down. Two descriptions appear repeatedly in the surviving fragments, and they don't fully align with each other. One describes the Pale Wasting as a star-spawned plague, something that swept through worlds like a disease, consuming populations and leaving emptiness behind. The other describes nightmare engines, vast mechanical constructions that ground through entire sectors, slaughtering everyone and everything. Whether these are two separate accounts of the same thing, two aspects of a single unified threat, or descriptions of two different components of a coordinated attack, is entirely unclear. The plague description and the mechanical engines description are both worth dwelling on individually. A plague that sweeps across worlds implies something biological, or at minimum, something that propagates through exposure, through contact, that moves in the way disease moves. The image of a star-spawned plague is deeply unsettling because it suggests something that doesn't need ships, or armies, or logistics. It just spreads. You catch it from proximity to a world that already has it. And then you have it. And then the worlds near yours have it. And then the worlds near those worlds have it. That kind of propagation is essentially unstoppable through conventional military means. You can't shoot a plague, you can only quarantine. And by the time you understand what you're quarantining against, the quarantine is already too late. Nightmare engines is a different image entirely. Hard, cold, mechanical. The suggestion of vast constructed things, weapons of some kind, moving through space and through worlds with remorseless geometric purpose. Not spreading, but traveling. Not infecting, but destroying. Two completely different modes of threat, and the Pale Wasting may have been both at once, or one that appeared as both, or something that the human minds trying to record it couldn't perceive clearly enough to describe consistently. The combination of organic spread and mechanical slaughter speaks to something with multiple methods of attack, something that adapted its approach to the specific vulnerabilities of each target. What is clear, devastatingly clear, that is the scale of it. 11 Space Marine chapters were lost. 11 gone. Not depleted, not driven back, not forced to retreat, destroyed. And the chronicles of the chapters that did participate and survive are, as noted in the records, curiously empty of any reference to this conflict. Warriors who fought there came home and said nothing. The Nova Marines chapter is the only one known by name to have participated and survived, and they hold the record of the Pale Wasting as one of their earliest battle honours. A stele in the Imperial Palace on Terra records their service and praises them for having, in the words carved into that stone, unmade that which cannot die. Think about that phrase for a moment. Unmade that which cannot die. Sure, whatever came out of the Ghoul Stars during the Nova Terra Interregnum was something that could not die by conventional means. something that required unmaking rather than killing. The Nova Marine's own chronicles are silent on the subject. They were there. They know what happened. They won't say. 11 chapters. Each chapter is roughly 1,000 warriors. 11,000 space marines, gone. In a setting where the loss of a single chapter is treated as a major catastrophe requiring centuries of investigation and memorial, the loss of 11 simultaneously is almost incomprehensible. These weren't new chapters either, founded and destroyed before they could build their histories. These were chapters that had been fighting since the second founding or close to it, or organizations with centuries of accumulated lore and tradition and specialized knowledge, all of it gone. All of those warriors, those legacies, those chapter cultures, just ended. The pale wasting didn't just kill people. It deleted entire communities of knowledge and tradition. The connection to the death specters is direct and explicit. In the aftermath of the pale wasting, the Imperium initiated the 13th founding of Space Marine chapters. And of all the foundings in Imperial history, the 13th is the strangest by a significant margin. Normally, founding events are extensively documented. The High Lords of Terror record which chapters are being created, from which gene seed, under what mandate, assigned to what territory. Banks of original gene seed are preserved on Terra, so that if anything goes wrong, if a chapter's genetic material starts degrading or mutating dangerously, the Adeptus Mechanicus has a baseline to compare against. This is standard practice, established after the Horus Heresy, maintained without exception across every founding from the second onward, except the 13th. The 13th founding has no reliable records of how many chapters were created during it. No records of which gene seed was used for which chapter. No records of where the created chapters were assigned. The gene seed banks on Terra have no preserved samples from the 13th founding. There is nothing. The Inquisition has investigated and found only that the records should exist and don't. The most charitable interpretation is bureaucratic failure during an unusually chaotic period of Imperial history. The less charitable interpretation is that the 13th founding was secret on purpose, that what was created during it was not meant to be widely known, and that the records were suppressed the same way the records of the Pale Wasting were suppressed. This is why the 13th founding is also called the Dark Founding. Consider the implications of that name in the context of the setting. The Imperium names things based on what they are, practically and instinctively. The Dark Founding is called dark, not because it happened at night or in a gloomy political climate, though it did happen during one of the grimmer periods of Imperial history. It's called dark because it was conducted in darkness, intentionally, deliberately. Whatever was created in the 13th founding was created without the usual light of Imperial record-keeping and bureaucratic oversight. Someone with enormous authority decided that these chapters needed to exist, but that the broader Imperium shouldn't know they existed, or at minimum shouldn't know the details of their creation and purpose. 2 chapters are known with reasonable certainty to have come from the Dark Founding. The Exorcists, whose founding involved a classified experiment in which each aspirant is briefly possessed by a genuine chaos demon before having it expelled, theoretically creating warriors with an unparalleled understanding of and resistance to demonic corruption. The process is sanctioned by a special decree called a Bull Absolute, issued by the inquisitorial representative to the Senatorum Imperialis, which is about the highest level of classified authorization in the imperial bureaucracy. The exorcist's method is considered heretical by most standards and is protected only by that specific decree. And the death specters. The timing tells a story even if the records don't. Something came out of the Ghoul Stars. It was devastating enough to destroy 11 Space Marine chapters and nearly bring down entire sectors before being stopped. Whatever stopped it, whatever unmade that which cannot die, the Imperium looked at what had happened and made a decision. They needed something permanently stationed at the border of the Ghoul Stars, watching, waiting, holding the line against anything that might come out again. They needed a chapter purpose-built for that duty, created in secret, assigned in secret, and funded and sustained through methods that don't appear in the standard Imperial records. There's also the question of what tools they needed to give this chapter to do the job. If the pale wasting was something that couldn't die by conventional means, then the chapter guarding the border against its return might need unconventional means. The exorcists are equipped with knowledge of demonic corruption in ways that most chapters find disturbing. Perhaps the Death Specters were equipped with something equally unconventional and equally necessary, something that required the records of their founding to be suppressed. They created the Death Specters, pointed them at the dark, and then, as far as the broader Imperium was concerned, more or less forgot they existed. The Death Specters, for their part, have not forgotten. Yet in the 7,000 or so years since their founding, through every crisis, every fracture, every catastrophe that has battered the Imperium, they have remained at their post, alone, without reinforcement from the main body of Imperial space, without the supply lines and tithing systems that most chapters rely on. They have sustained themselves, maintained their numbers, built and preserved their own small empire at the edge of the known galaxy, and they have watched the Ghoul Stars. They are still watching now. The cemetery world of Aludus, before the Death Specters called it home, before it became the seat of a chapter's power and the location of one of the strangest secrets in the Imperium. The world of Aludus had a history of its own that's worth understanding. After the scouring of the Nostromo sector, as a campaign fought in the decades following the Horus heresy that involved the hunting down of the Night Lord's home territory, Aludus was established as a deep monitoring station, a listening post at the edge of the Ghoul Stars, a place where loyal forces kept a quiet, permanent watch on what was moving in the deep dark. That monitoring station was eventually given to Chrysos Morturg, a figure whose connection to the Death Specters' homeworld is one of the more intriguing threads in the chapter's background. Morturg had been a member of the Death Guard Legion before the Horus heresy, a loyalist who survived the Istvan III atrocity through means that stretched the definition of survival, and who spent the years of the heresy hunting down traitor Death Guard with a personal fury that bordered on obsession. Yet he was a psyker in a legion whose Primarch had banned psykers, which made him an outsider even among those who called themselves his brothers. After the heresy ended, Morturg was given command of what was called the 108th Independent Company, and assigned to Aludus, there to maintain watch over the borders of the Ghoul Stars. What happened to Morturg after that is unknown. Whether he died in the line of duty, whether he left his post for reasons unrecorded, whether he's still somehow out there in some form, the records don't say. What the records do say is that by the time the 13th founding occurred, sometime in the 35th or 36th millennium, Aludus was available for the Death Specters to claim as their own. And there is something deeply poetic, whether intentional or not, about a world that was a monitoring station becoming the permanent home of a chapter whose entire purpose is to monitor and contain. But the choice of Aludus as the Death Specters' homeworld wasn't purely logistical. It wasn't the chapter's leadership looking at a map and selecting the most strategically advantageous location. According to the chapter's own history, the choice was made because the Emperor showed them where to go. When the first chapter master of the Death Specters, a man named Merin Kadash, went to the Golden Throne on Terra to swear his oaths of service, something happened. He received a vision. The Emperor, sitting on his throne and maintaining the psychic infrastructure that keeps the Astronomicon lit and the warp storms at bay, somehow communicated to this newly made chapter master, showing him a world, a location, and something buried beneath it. And Kadash, who might have been forgiven for writing off the experience as stress or imagination or the overwhelming intensity of standing in the presence of that much psychic power, instead took his entire newly created chapter and followed the vision to its conclusion. He led them to Aludus, and beneath the surface of that world, in a cavern that no one had previously found or catalogued, he found exactly what the vision had shown him, the Shariaks. But we'll get to that. What matters first is Aludus itself, because the world the Death Specters chose as their home shaped who they became in profound ways. Aludus is what is classified as a cemetery world. The category sounds almost archaic in the context of the grim, industrial violence of the 41st millennium, but cemetery worlds are real, and they carry a particular weight in the setting. They are worlds given over almost entirely to the dead, to tombs, mausoleums, graveyards that stretch across entire continents, to monuments and ossuaries and memorial structures that dwarf the modest towns of the living who maintain them. These worlds serve the Imperium as burial grounds for those wealthy or important enough to afford a final resting place off-world, or as memorial sites for events of sufficient magnitude to merit permanent planetary-scale commemoration. They are quiet worlds, worlds defined by absence and by the long, patient architecture of remembrance. To choose such a world as your home, to raise your fortress monastery on a planet of graves, says something about your relationship to death. But the death specters didn't settle on Aludus in spite of its nature. They settled there because of it. The fortress monastery itself is called Logopol, and it sits directly above the hidden chamber where the Sharia waits in the dark. The choice of placement was Kadash's decision, and it was deliberate. Logopol was built as a garrison above the secret it guards, a permanent structure whose presence serves a dual function. It houses and organizes the chapter's military operations across the Ghoul Stars, and it conceals what lies beneath. Below the fortress, a labyrinthine catacomb system extends into the rock, and within those catacombs are interred the bodies of death specters who have fallen in battle, where other chapters might maintain halls of remembrance with statues or inscribed names. As the death specters bring their dead home and put them in the earth, the catacombs beneath Logopol have been filling for thousands of years. The death specters find these places calming, peaceful. When a battle brother needs contemplation or rest, he walks the tomb cities and graveyards of Aludus. He sits among the monuments. He breathes the still, cold air of a world that has made peace with death. In a chapter whose entire culture is built around the understanding and acceptance of mortality, around the ritual experience of dying and returning, the cemetery world is not a grim choice. It's a natural one. Home. The broader territory around Aludus that the death specters control includes what are called breeding worlds, and a term that needs unpacking because it's simultaneously one of the most fascinating and most morally complicated elements of the chapter's lore. Because the Ghoul Stars are so remote and so dangerous, because the death specters can't rely on the usual Imperial supply infrastructure, they need to manage their own recruitment pool, and the usual method, descending on a feudal world and selecting aspirants from the strongest and most promising young men, doesn't work well when most of the nearest worlds are either dead, occupied by hostile xenos, or so dangerous that the populations are in constant survival mode. So the death specters do something else. They identify what they call prime stock, human individuals whose genetic profile suggests they produce exceptional aspirants for the gene seed implantation process. But they take those individuals from wherever they find them, usually from worlds at the fringes of human settlement in the region, and they bring them to designated breeding worlds. Those worlds are then encouraged to maintain and grow their populations, with the death specters selecting aspirants from among the young men born there in subsequent generations. The broader territory around Aludus that the death specters control includes what are called breeding worlds, a term that needs unpacking because it's simultaneously one of the most fascinating and most morally complicated elements of the chapter's lore. Because the Ghoul Stars are so remote and so dangerous, because the death specters can't rely on the usual Imperial supply infrastructure, they need to manage their own recruitment pool, and the usual method, and descending on a feudal world and selecting aspirants from the strongest and most promising young men, doesn't work well when most of the nearest worlds are either dead, occupied by hostile xenos, or so dangerous that the populations are in constant survival mode. So the death specters do something else. They identify what they call prime stock, human individuals whose genetic profile suggests they produce exceptional aspirants for the gene seed implantation process.
I want to pause here for a second because this is actually the part of the Death Specters that got me hooked on them in the first place. Most chapters, you read their lore and it feels like a checklist. Here's their homeworld, here's their founding, here's a battle they won. The Sharia just stopped me cold the first time I read about it. The idea that every single chapter master sits on the thing knowing full well it's going to slowly turn them to stone, and they do it anyway because the power it gives them is worth it to protect their brothers. I don't know, but that hits differently. It's not heroic in a clean way. It's desperate and sad and a little horrifying, which honestly just makes it feel more real. But that's the kind of lore that keeps me making videos about this setting. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
They take those individuals from wherever they find them, usually from worlds at the fringes of human settlement in the region, and they bring them to designated breeding worlds. Those worlds are then encouraged to maintain and grow their populations, with the Death Specters selecting aspirants from among the young men born there in subsequent generations. The short story called Flayed, written by Cavan Scott, gives us a ground-level perspective on what this looks like from the human end of the process. The story follows a woman named Alundra, who lives on a world in the Ghoul Stars region that comes under attack by flayed ones, Necrons afflicted with the curse that drives them to wear living flesh. The Death Specters arrive, identify the population as containing prime stock, and begin extracting people from the world before destroying it through exterminatus. Alundra finds herself taken to a breeding world. She hasn't asked for this. She hasn't been given a choice. The Death Specters have determined that her genetic potential is valuable and that her world is going to be destroyed anyway, and so she's being relocated. From the Death Specters' perspective, as this is resource management and long-term strategic planning, they are saving those lives and using them to serve the chapter's survival and therefore the Ghoul Stars' vigil. From Alundra's perspective, she's been taken from her world by figures that have just destroyed her home and placed on an unfamiliar world to serve a purpose she didn't choose. The local human populations in the Ghoul Stars region, the ones who have heard of or encountered this practice, often regard the Death Specters with the same fear they feel toward the Necrons or the Scythe or Fiends, which says something uncomfortable about how this looks from the ground, even if the chapter's intentions are purely functional rather than malicious. This is the 41st millennium. Moral complexity is built into the bones of the setting. What the Death Specters do what they do because the alternative is failing in their vigil. And failing in their vigil means whatever came through the pale wasting gets to come through again. The calculus they're working from places the survival of the Ghoul Stars border above the autonomy of individuals in the region. Whether that calculus is correct is a question the lore declines to answer, because the setting doesn't offer clean answers to that kind of question. What is worth noting is that the Death Specters, despite the fear they inspire, are not described as deliberately cruel toward the populations they work with. They are cold, precise, and utterly certain of the correctness of their methods. But there's no sadism in it. They regard the humans in the Ghoul Stars region as resources, which is unnerving. But they're not resources to be exploited and discarded. The breeding worlds are maintained and protected. The populations there live their lives. They just live them within a framework that the Death Specters constructed and control. It's a strange kind of paternalism, one that exists entirely for reasons the people under it have no access to, sustained by a purpose they don't know about, on behalf of a duty they've never been told about. The families on those breeding worlds don't know why they were brought there. They don't know what the Death Specters are working toward. They simply live, and occasionally, one of their sons disappears and comes back changed beyond recognition in black armor with red eyes. At the Shariaks, the throne that devours its masters, here is where the Death Specters go from being merely unusual and become genuinely extraordinary. Beneath Logopole, beneath the fortress monastery built on a cemetery world at the edge of the galaxy's worst neighborhood, there is a chamber. The Death Specters call it the Temple of Voices. It is ancient, not old in the sense of centuries or millennia, but old in the sense that suggests it was here before any Imperial presence on Aludus, before the monitoring station, before the heresy. Old in the way that suggests something was placed here and left here a very long time ago by something that understood what it was doing. Inside the Temple of Voices, in a dome cut from living rock and sealed against every method of detection that the Adeptus Mechanicus has ever brought to bear, there is a throne. It appears to be made of glass. It's called the Sharia. Little is known of its purpose. Nothing is known of its origins. That sentence appears almost verbatim in the law, and it's not boilerplate hedging. Those two statements are as precise as anything anyone has managed to determine about the Sharia, despite generations of the Death Spectre's own scholars and artificers studying it. The throne predates any known technology. It doesn't match the visual or material signature of any catalogued alien species. The Adeptus Mechanicus would classify it as archaeotech if they knew it existed, but they don't, because the Death Specters have never told them. The Inquisition would want to study it, or more likely destroy it, if they knew it was there. But they don't know, because the Death Specters have never told them either. And the Death Specters are, by all available evidence, absolutely terrified of what would happen if anyone outside the chapter found out the Sharia exists. Here is what it does, as far as anyone knows. When a new chapter master, a new Magir, is appointed to lead the Death Specters, he performs his oaths of office in the standard way, and then he descends into the Temple of Voices, and he sits down on the Sharia, and from that moment until the day he dies, he never gets up again. Not because the throne restrains him physically, not because there are chains or locks involved, because the Sharia, in exchange for granting something, begins to slowly drain the life of whoever sits in it. The chapter master is still capable of thought, still capable of communicating with the outside world, or still capable of directing the chapter's affairs in the broad strokes, if not the day-to-day details. But his body begins to fail. The process is gradual, playing out over years or decades depending on the individual's constitution, and it ends in what might be the most surreal fate in the entire 40K setting. The Magir eventually turns to stone, literally petrified. His body slowly calcifies as the Sharia drains him, until one day there is no more chapter master, only a statue in the Temple of Voices, and the chapter must choose his successor. The chair of glass, as it's sometimes called, slowly petrifies its occupants into stone. Think about what that means on a human level for a moment. A space marine, one of the most physically extraordinary beings the Imperium produces, as a warrior bred for centuries of service and forged through impossible trials, sits down knowing that he will never stand up again, knowing that the end of his service and the end of his life will come in the same moment, when the throne has taken everything it needs from him and he simply stops being able to sustain himself. And the Magirs do this willingly, every single one. No chapter master of the Death Specters has ever refused the throne, ever. 7,000 years of history, and not one of them has looked at what the Sharia is and said no. That level of collective commitment to a practice that costs this much is staggering. It speaks to how deeply the chapter believes in what the Sharia does, in what would happen if its occupant ever stepped away before the throne took him. Because that's the thing, the Death Specters believe, whilst with what appears to be absolute conviction, that the Sharia is doing something, that the power it grants, the power so vast that psychers in orbit feel it pressing against their senses, is holding something back, is maintaining some kind of vigil or barrier or ward over the Ghoul Stars that makes it possible for the Death Specters to do their job. And that if that power ever went offline, if the throne were ever vacated by choice rather than death, the consequences would be catastrophic. Catastrophic in a way that the Death Specters describe as existential for the Imperium. Not just bad, not just a setback, finished, over. When the Deathwatch novel that provides most of the chapter's in-depth lore covers this, the implication is not understated. Without the Shariax's power sustaining the watch, without the Magir fulfilling his terrible bargain, something comes through from the Ghoul Stars, something that the Pale Wasting was perhaps only a preview of. There's a practical governance question buried in the Shariax arrangement that's worth addressing. If the Medium is sitting in a chamber beneath the fortress monastery, slowly turning to stone, who is actually running the chapter day to day? The answer is the Menrahir, the chapter council, a body of senior officers who handle the practical administration of everything the Death Specters do. The Megir is still technically an authority over everything, and on major decisions or moments of particular significance, he can apparently make his will known. But he's not attending tactical briefings or reviewing supply manifests. The chapter council does that work. The Menrahir operates the chapter, the way a cabinet operates a government whose leader is physically incapacitated but still nominally present. The most senior members who have direct and regular access to the Megir are the first captain, the senior combat officer, and the Messazar, the chief librarian. Everyone else goes through the council. The Megir's communications from the depths of the temple are reserved for genuinely significant moments, decisions of extraordinary weight, revelations of things that only the Sharia allows its occupant to perceive. When the Megir speaks from the throne, the chapter listens absolutely. The parallels to the Golden Throne on Terra are impossible to ignore and are surely intentional, as both the Shariaks and the Golden Throne are extraordinary artifacts of unknown origin that sustain enormous psychic power by slowly consuming whoever sits in them. Both are secrets kept by those closest to them, for fear of what the broader Imperium would do if it knew the truth. Both represent an implicit bargain, an individual life given over completely in exchange for the continuation of something that cannot be replaced. Whether there is an actual connection between the two artifacts, whether the Shariax is in some way a cousin or counterpart or fragment of the same underlying technology as the Golden Throne, or whether the similarity is thematic coincidence, the lore doesn't say. The lore, characteristically for this chapter, says nothing definitive. It raises the question and leaves it hanging. Yints consider also that the Temple of Voices is called what it's called. Voices, plural. What does someone sitting in the deep dark of that chamber hear? The accounts of Megirs who have communicated from the throne describe something like enhanced perception, an awareness of forces and patterns in the Ghoul Stars that can't be seen any other way, an ability to feel the subtle movements of whatever inhabits that dark region in ways that normal sense and even psychosense can't achieve. They hear things, they know things, and that knowledge is why they don't get up. What it does say is that among the Death Specters' deepest beliefs, deeper even than their military doctrine or their martial traditions, is the conviction that a Kadash is coming, a living chalice, someone, some individual of enormous psychic significance, who will one day take their place on the Shariax and bring about something the chapter calls the Great Resurrection. The leadership of the Death Specters has been, according to the law, deliberately engineering the conditions for this person's arrival throughout the chapter's entire history. Every generation of Megirs, every council decision, every seemingly minor strategic choice has been shaped in part by this long game, this preparation for a prophesied event that may still be centuries away. What the Great Resurrection actually is, what it involves, and whether it's genuinely a resurrection of something great or a catastrophe wearing the clothes of salvation, are questions the law pointedly doesn't answer. The psyker whose career is most closely connected to the Sharia's prophecy in the available fiction is Leandro Carras, who's chief librarian of the Death Specters and the protagonist of Steve Parker's Deathwatch novel. Carras carries the chapter's ancient relic force sword, the Archiman, which was the very sword Kadash laid at the feet of the Golden Throne before receiving his vision. The sword itself has a psychic spirit bound to it that melds with its wielder. Carras's life is shadowed by a prophecy that the chapter's leadership knows about, and he doesn't. A trail of fate being managed by people who believe they're steering towards something inevitable and necessary. Whether Carras is the Kadash, whether he has some role in the Great Resurrection, or whether the prophecy points to someone else entirely, is left deliberately open. Parker created something that functions as the beginning of a story whose end hasn't been written yet. It's the children of Korax, gene seed, mutations, and the face of death, the Death Specters are confirmed descendants of the Raven Guard, sons of Korax, and their gene seed tells that story clearly in the ways it has shaped their bodies. But the path from gene parent to successor chapter is rarely clean, and the Death Specters' genetic inheritance comes with its own specific deviations that distinguish them from both their progenitors and every other chapter in the Imperium. The most immediately visible of these is albinism. Every Death Spectre, without exception, is an albino. Their skin is not pale in the way that many Northern European humans are pale, or even in the way that unenhanced people who spend too much time indoors are pale. It is corpse white, bleached of all pigmentation, the kind of pale that reads as wrong to human instinct, which is that triggers the deep-seated recognition that something about this person's physiology is different from the baseline. When you add the red eyes, the effect is complete. The melanchromic organ is what's responsible. In a healthy space marine, this organ manages melanin production, which has implications beyond skin color, including protection from radiation and adaptability to different environmental conditions. In Raven Guard's successors generally, the organ tends toward reduced functionality, giving those chapter warriors their characteristic pallid complexions. In the Death Specters, the organ effectively doesn't function at all. No melanin is produced. The result is a warrior whose appearance is a perfect visual manifestation of what they stand for, pale as the dead, marked by their biology to look like the void they guard. As this is worth comparing across the Raven Guard family for a moment, because the Death Specters represent the furthest expression of this tendency. The Raven Guard themselves have notably pale skin and dark eyes, a stark monochrome look that reflects their shadowed Primarch Corvus Corax, who was himself pale and dark-haired in a way that distinguished him even among Primarchs. The Raptors and Revilers, other Raven Guard successors, share some of these traits, but none of them take it as far as the Death Specters, where the albinism is complete rather than partial and is combined with the additional mutation of the red irises. It's as though the Death Specters' gene seed drifted further from the original template while still remaining clearly recognizable as Raven Guard in origin. 7,000 years of isolation, just with no gene seed samples preserved on Terra to compare against, is enough time for that kind of drift. The red eyes are a further mutation, a separate quirk of the gene seed that gives the irises a blood-red coloration. The visual effect, in low light or darkness, is a faint crimson luminescence, eyes that glow like coals in the deep. Given that the Death Specters fight constantly in the lightless corridors of ancient alien structures, in the void, cold darkness between stars, in the shadows of a region of space where the light itself feels wrong, these eyes are fitting. They are built for the dark in a way that goes beyond adaptation. Most Death Specters also lose their hair during the gene seed implantation process, though a portion retain it. The overall appearance of a Death Specter warrior is therefore often bald, chalk white, a red-eyed, armoured in black ceramite with one white pauldron and a bone-coloured helmet. The chapter symbol is a skull flanked by two crossed scythes. They look exactly like what they are, a chapter that has built an entire culture around the acceptance of death, that has looked at mortality so directly and for so long that it has stopped feeling like an enemy and started feeling like a companion. There's something worth sitting with here aesthetically, because the Death Specters' visual design is genuinely one of the most distinctive in the setting. Most Space Marine chapters have a colour scheme that communicates something about their identity. The Blood Angels' red and gold suggest divinity and sacrifice. The Ultramarines' blue communicates loyalty and structure. The Black Templars' black and white reflects crusading fervour. But the Death Specters' scheme is black with a single white pauldron and pale helmet. The dominant black reads as void, as death, as the dark between stars. The single white shoulder is ghostly against it, a pale contrast that draws the eye. And the bone-white helmet frames those red eyes and blanched face in a way that makes every Death Specter warrior look like he's already halfway between living and dead, which, given what they go through in their initiation, he is. The lost organs tell their own story. The mucranoid and Betcher's gland are both non-functional in Death Specters, exactly as they are in their Raven Guard progenitors. The mucranoid creates a waxy substance that protects a space marine against extreme temperatures and vacuum exposure, which seems like a significant loss for a chapter that fights in the void constantly. Or the Betcher's gland allows a space marine to produce acid that can be used as a weapon or to corrode restraints. Its absence is less tactically significant, but part of the pattern of the Death Specters being slightly diminished from the baseline Space Marine template in specific ways. What they lack in those specific capabilities, they more than compensate for in other ways. The Death Specters have an unusually high proportion of psychers in their ranks, a librarius that is deeply central to the chapter's military and spiritual operations, rather than being a supporting element. This makes sense given the nature of their enemies and the importance of the Shariaks, which appears to require, or at least benefit from psychic attunement in its custodians. The chief librarian, the Messazar, is second in authority only to the Magir himself, just which is itself unusual in a chapter's structure. And the Messazar is explicitly named as the Magir's heir apparent, the one who would take the throne next if the current occupant were to complete his final stone-still journey. The psychic density in the Death Specters may be more than just convenient for managing the Shariaks. The Black River, the phenomenon that aspirants encounter during their initiation deaths, appears to be a psychic event that only those with at least latent psychic ability can navigate. If most of the warriors who survive the first death and make it through the implantation process already have some degree of psychic sensitivity, then the chapter is naturally self-selecting for psychers in a way that most chapters aren't. Most chapters identify psychers among their ranks with some regularity and route them to the librarius, while the majority of their warriors serve as non-psyker combatants. The Death Specters may have a different balance, where the psychic element is distributed more broadly through the chapter, rather than concentrated in a dedicated subset. The connection to Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard runs deeper than Geneseed. The Raven Guard are defined by shadow, by stealth, by the idea that the most powerful weapon is often the one the enemy never sees. Their Primarch was a revolutionary and a guerrilla, a lord of ambush and deception, who turned his legion's reduced numbers after Istvan into a tactical advantage through patience and precision. The Death Specters carry this inheritance into their specific context. On the edge of the galaxy, against enemies that include things immune to conventional killing, against things that defy straight-line military logic, the Raven Guard doctrine of watching from darkness and striking from unexpected angles has been refined over 7,000 years into something very effective and very strange. The fact that the Death Specters' lineage was initially somewhat ambiguous in the lore is itself interesting. For years, their Geneseed heritage was described as suspected rather than confirmed, with the physical similarities to the Raven Guard suggestive but not definitive. It was in Steve Parker's Deathwatch fiction that the connection was explicitly confirmed when a Death Specter librarian directly stated his chapter's heritage. Parker had apparently grown frustrated with Games Workshop's policy of leaving chapter heritage ambiguous, as a policy that exists to give writers flexibility but that can feel unsatisfying to readers who want answers. He simply put the answer in the text. Yes, the Death Specters are sons of Corax. The shadows are in the blood. How the dead are made. Recruitment and the three deaths. The Death Specters' initiation process is, among all the many initiation processes across the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, one of the most extreme. And given that this is a category that includes the exorcists, making recruits serve as temporary vessels for chaos demons, and the space wolves pitting aspirants against psychically awakened murderous beasts on a death world, and the blood angels inducing a spiritual crisis of such intensity that it simulates the experience of their Primarch's death, the competition for most extreme is genuinely stiff. Indeed, the Death Specters belong in that conversation. The aspirants of the Death Specters are expected to die, not metaphorically, not in the sense of leaving their old life behind, actually die and come back, more than once. The process for at least the librarius aspirants, and it's suggested that similar elements apply to all aspirants in varying degrees, involves what the chapter calls the three deaths. Each one is a genuine encounter with mortality, a genuine cessation of biological function followed by return, and each one is considered formative in a way that goes beyond mere physical testing. The first death happens early in the aspirant's life, around the age of 10 standard years, at approximately the beginning of the gene seed organ implantation process. The aspirant is administered a lethal toxin, not a near-lethal toxin, as a lethal one, something calculated to actually stop the heart, actually end the biological functions that constitute life, and then the aspirant is left alone. The trial is whether he comes back. Coming back requires something the death specters describe as navigating the Black River, a phenomenon that their librarious aspirants apparently encounter during the death experience. A vision or psychic event or genuine metaphysical place, depending on how literally you take it, where the currents of fate and time press against the dying person and where what the chapter calls forces, understood to mean something in the family of chaos demons, are drawn to the person by the Black River's energies. The first death is described as the hardest in terms of the challenge it poses, because the aspirant has no preparation, no experience, has no framework for what's happening. He just dies and then either finds his way back or doesn't. Failure is total and permanent. The death specters do not resuscitate aspirants artificially. If a young boy can't fight his way back from that first death, he's simply gone. The chapter records the loss and moves on. This sounds brutal and is brutal, but it's also, functionally, a perfect test for what the death specters need, because the qualities that allow someone to return from death are precisely the qualities they need their warriors to have. An enormous strength of will, a relationship with mortality that is defined by refusal and endurance rather than terror and submission, and a psychic sensitivity, however latent, that makes the Black River navigable. There's something worth appreciating about the mechanics of this test. As in most Space Marine initiation processes, the trials are designed to identify and eliminate aspirants who lack the physical or psychological qualities the chapter needs, while preserving those who have them. The Death Specter's first death does the same thing, but it does it by creating the very quality it's testing for. An aspirant who survives the first death and returns from it isn't the same person who went in. He has been somewhere else. He has stood in the Black River and found a way back. Whatever he was before, he is now someone who has done that. The test doesn't just identify who has what it takes. It changes those who have it into something new. Those who survive the first death undergo the standard Astartes organ implantation process over the following years, of the long and painful transformation that makes a human boy into a space marine. At the end of that process, when the new neophyte is ready to be formally admitted into the chapter as a full battle brother, a second death occurs. This one is more intensive. The aspirant experiences death for solar hours, rather than the minutes of the first trial. The Black River is encountered again, this time with the full complement of gene seed organs already integrated into the aspirant's physiology, which makes the experience both more powerful and more dangerous. The hours of the second death are a test of sustained endurance rather than sudden shock. The first death is over quickly, relatively speaking. A person either finds their way back in minutes or doesn't find it at all. The second death requires the aspirant to hold their orientation, show to maintain their sense of self and purpose, across an extended period in a place where time operates differently than it does in the physical world. This is the death that fully initiates a warrior into the chapter, and the depth of transformation it produces is described as qualitative rather than just quantitative. After the second death, a death spectre carries the experience of dying for hours in his biological memory, and that experience is present in everything he does from that point forward. Members of the Librarius, who wish to advance to the rank of Codicea, which is one step above the entry rank and represents a meaningful elevation in psychic capability and authority, face a third death. This one is the most intense of all and the most dangerous. The chapter considers it a threshold rather than a test, but those who return from the third death are genuinely changed. Their relationship with what lies on the other side of consciousness is no longer purely instinctive but informed, practiced, calibrated. What exactly the Black River is remains one of the chapter's deeper mysteries. The description of it as a representation of fate and time, with currents that press against those who enter it and draw malevolent forces toward them, sounds in several ways like a metaphor for warp travel, or for psychoactivity, or for the phenomenon of a soul moving through whatever exists between biological death and whatever follows. Whether it's a genuine psychic phenomenon, a consistent shared vision produced by the gene seed, a real place in the Imperium that Death Spectre aspirants actually visit, or a cultural framework that the chapter imposes on an otherwise ineffable experience is deliberately left unclear. The forces that the Black River draws toward the dying aspirant are described as what might politely be called entities of the warp, the kind of thing that chaos worshippers name as demons. If what the aspirant encounters during the death experience includes genuine warp entities pressing against their soul, then the Black River trials are not just tests of willpower. They are combat experiences in a dimension where the weapons are will and identity and the refusal to be consumed. Every Death Spectre who has completed the trials has faced that kind of predation and survived it. The chapter's warriors are not just experienced fighters in the physical sense. They are hardened in ways that can't be easily quantified. And this is also part of why Death Spectres tend toward a certain equanimity in the face of things that frighten other warriors. They've been in the dark. They felt the things that inhabit it pressing against them. They came back. The creatures from the Ghoul Stars, the things that operate outside normal physics and categorization, the horrors that would break less prepared soldiers, are not more frightening than what a Death Spectre has already survived. They're just another current in the Black River, and he knows how to navigate. What isn't unclear is the effect. Death Spectres emerge from their initiation process having genuinely died and genuinely returned, and that experience defines how they understand themselves and their chapter's purpose. They don't fight death. They've already died. They've come back. As death is not the end of the story for them, it's a chapter in it, perhaps the most important one, and one that has to be faced directly and navigated rather than avoided. This is why the burial practices of the chapter make sense beyond the aesthetics. When a Death Spectre falls in battle, if his body can be recovered, it's brought home to Aludus and placed in the catacombs beneath Logopole. He is mummified. His remains are preserved in a form that echoes the preservation of the individual's story, even after the individual himself is gone. The chapter tends to its dead with the same attention it gives to its living warriors, because the dead, in the Death Spectre's theology, are not simply absent, they are waiting. The entire culture of the chapter is downstream from this belief. Death is not a destination, but a state, and states can change. The mummified warriors in the catacombs are not trophies or relics. They are members of the chapter who have completed one phase and are waiting for the next. When the great resurrection comes, when the Kadash takes the Sharia and the prophecy fulfills itself, those warriors will not be left behind. That's the promise embedded in the mummification, in the preservation, in the gentle care with which the chapter tends its dead across the centuries. The Death Specters have been dying and coming back since before the 41st millennium began. They are going to do it one more time. Collectively, all of them. On the day when the living chalice takes the throne of glass and unmakes what cannot die and opens the door to whatever comes next. The Black River, culture, beliefs, and the great resurrection. The culture of the Death Specters is one of the richest and most fully realized aspects of their lore, which makes it somewhat ironic that so little of it has been directly depicted in fiction. Most of what we know comes from the Deathwatch novel and its associated short stories, from the Codex Astartes entries that mention them, and from the careful piecing together of implications that careful readers have assembled over the years. At the center of everything is death. This seems obvious given the chapter's name, their homeworld, their initiation trials, their aesthetic of skulls and scythes and black armor. But the Death Specter's relationship with death is more nuanced than simple morbidity or an edgy preoccupation with darkness. Their entire theology is built around the belief that death is transitional rather than terminal, that those who die in the Emperor's service are not simply gone but are preserved in some meaningful way, waiting for a return that the chapter calls the Great Resurrection. The chapter master is called the Megir, from the Occludan dialect of Low Gothic, the language of the people native to their homeworld. The title translates roughly to First Spectre. The most senior librarian is called the Messazar. The first company veterans are called the Wargeists. The gesture of respect and formal greeting within the chapter is called the Masrahim, translated as the salute of skull and throne. It's performed by placing the left hand palm up against the abdomen, then placing the right hand as a closed fist in the left palm. Whilst the symbolism is explicit, the throne you hold in your open hand, ready to sustain, and the fist that represents the force of will you bring to the service of that throne. Persian and Egyptian influences are detectable throughout the chapter's naming conventions and cultural practices, which are among the richer cultural borrowings in the setting's broader design. Egyptian in particular, given the mummification of the dead, the vast underground tomb complexes, the deeply hierarchical structure of the chapter's spiritual and military organization, and the themes of death and rebirth that suffuse everything. Persian in the naming conventions and the aesthetic vocabulary of their official designations. These cultural threads give the death specters a texture and a sense of history that feel earned rather than grafted on. The Order is the name for the chapter's cult, the spiritual framework within which all death specters operate. The Megir is its grandmaster as well as its chapter master. The Messazar is the Megir's spiritual heir as well as his military successor. The Order's practices, rituals, and beliefs are closely guarded within the chapter, not out of arrogance or secrecy for its own sake, but because the Order's knowledge includes the truth about the Shariaks, and the Shariak's truth is a secret the chapter believes it must protect. The belief in the Kadash, the living chalice, who will bring about the Great Resurrection, is the most significant long-term element of the chapter's culture. The Death Specters' leadership has been working toward this event for their entire existence, seeding conditions, making decisions shaped by prophecy, and preparing a succession of events that they believe will eventually produce the right person at the right moment. What exactly the Great Resurrection involves is never fully specified in the lore. The name implies something coming back to life at enormous scale. Given the context of the chapter's duty, the parallel to the Golden Throne, and the Emperor's own situation, and the existence of the Shariaks as an artifact of unknown but clearly vast power, the theories fan speculation widely. Some fans have suggested the Great Resurrection refers to the Emperor's return, that the Death Specters have been working toward the event that would end the Imperium's 10,000-year vigil over a corpse god who hasn't quite died yet. Some suggest it refers to something more local, a resurrection of the worlds and peoples lost to the pale wasting, and a reversal of whatever unmade those civilizations. Some suggest the Kadash will sit the Shariaks and use its power in a way that previous Megirs couldn't, changing the nature of the ward the chapter maintains over the Ghoul Stars, from a passive containment to something more definitive. None of these are confirmed. All of them are consistent with the available evidence. The lore leaves the space open, and the Death Specters as a chapter have existed within that ambiguity for so long that the ambiguity itself has become part of what they are. What's not ambiguous is how deeply this belief shapes the behavior of individual Death Specters. A battle brother of this chapter doesn't fight primarily out of loyalty to the Imperium's political structures, or even out of straightforward obedience to the dictates of the High Lords. Yet he fights because he believes, at a genuinely theological level, that his service is part of an unfolding plan that ends in something worth all of the sacrifice. He fights because his dead brothers, preserved in the catacombs beneath Logopol, are waiting for a resurrection that the Kadash's arrival will make possible. He fights because the Shariaks' power, bought at the cost of his chapter master's slow petrification, is holding a door closed against something that would end everything, and he is part of what stands between that door and the rest of humanity. This is an unusual combination of urgency and patience. Most Space Marines operate on a human-scale timeline, even if they live for centuries. The Death Specters operate on a geological one. Their plans have been in motion for 7,000 years. Just the Kadash prophecy was made at the chapter's founding by its first chapter master, before he sat the Sharia for the last time. Whatever preparation has been made for the Great Resurrection was initiated within the first generation of the chapter's history and has been sustained through every generation since. That kind of institutional memory, that kind of long-term strategic patience, is extremely rare in the Imperium, an organization that struggles to maintain records across centuries, let alone millennia. It suggests that whatever the Sharia grants the Magir includes some form of accumulated wisdom or foresight, that each successive occupant of the throne inherits something from his predecessor beyond just the physical seat, and that the Mezazar, who takes the next place in the lineage, carries forward a chain of understanding that has been building since Cadash's original vision at the foot of the Golden Throne. The cultural impact of all this on a day-to-day level is a chapter that is, by the standards of the setting, unusually calm, not passive, not disengaged, but settled in a way that comes from certainty. Death Specters know what they are and why they're here and what they're working toward. They have been doing it for longer than most human civilizations have existed. The isolation that would break most people, the relentless grinding duty in a place that offers no respite and no company except the Ghoul Stars' endless dark, has instead become the foundation of an identity so stable it's almost impossible to shake. Yet they also have a specific salute for acknowledging death, a gesture made between warriors when one passes, a moment of formal recognition that the dead brother is not lost, but waiting, that his service is not finished. It's a small thing, a physical motion, but in the context of a chapter where every member has already died at least once and come back from it, the gesture carries weight. It says, "We know what you've gone into. We've been there. We'll see you again." War in the Void, combat doctrine, and the Wargeists. When you think about the Death Specters in tactical terms, a few things immediately stand out. Their progenitor lineage, the Raven Guard, specialize in infiltration, stealth, and precision strikes. That inheritance shows up clearly in the Death Specters' approach to their unusual operational environment, and an environment that is, unlike anything most chapters regularly deal with, defined by the vacuum of space, by the alien geometries of ancient xenostructures, by corridors that don't follow standard architectural logic, and by enemies that sometimes can't be killed by conventional means. The basic doctrinal framework is broadly codex compliant. The chapter maintains the standard company structure, 10 companies of roughly 100 warriors each, though the specifics have been adapted to their needs. Where the Death Specters diverge from the standard, they diverge purposefully. The heaviest emphasis in their combat doctrine falls on assault marines and close combat specialists. In the siege of Lelithur during the 13th Black Crusade, the chapter committed approximately 600 warriors to a jump pack assault on a traitor stronghold. 600 Space Marines in jump packs, hitting a single fortified position simultaneously. That's not a surgical strike. That's a hammer blow designed to overwhelm defenses through sudden, overwhelming violence at close range. It speaks to a chapter that, for all its patience and subtlety in other respects, understands that against some enemies, and in some situations, nothing substitutes for direct, ferocious, inescapable physical force. This combination, stealth and patience and careful preparation, followed by overwhelming sudden assault, is itself a Raven Guard pattern applied in new contexts. The Death Specters can spend months identifying the optimal approach to a target, then commit everything at once. Their Raven Guard heritage gives them the patience for the former, their specific combat doctrine, honed against Xenos that require close-range destruction because long-range fire often bounces off, misses, or doesn't kill the way it's supposed to, has built the capacity for the latter. There's a specific logic to why close combat is emphasized over ranged fire for the types of enemies the Death Specters most frequently face. The flayed ones, for instance, are Necrons whose most disturbing quality is their resilience. Necron warriors regenerate, they get back up. A flayed one riddled with bolter rounds will sometimes reassemble itself and resume attacking. Close combat with power weapons is more reliable at producing the kind of damage that keeps Necron warriors down, because the energy disruption of powered blades and fists interferes with the self-repair nanite systems in ways that high-velocity but purely physical projectiles don't. And 7,000 years of fighting flayed ones has presumably given the Death Specters detailed practical knowledge of this. Similarly, things from the Ghoul Stars that defy standard categorization, the entities described as supernatural in Imperial records, may be less susceptible to ranged fire for reasons that are more metaphysical than physical. If some of what lives in the Ghoul Stars exists partially outside normal reality, then weapons that interact with that entity at close range, that are sustained and enhanced by psychic energy like power weapons are, may be more effective than weapons that have to bridge the distance between normal space and whatever else these things are occupying. The first company deserves particular attention because nothing makes a chapter's identity clearer than what it does with its most elite warriors. But for many chapters, the first company wears Terminator armor and carries the heaviest weapons in the arsenal. For others, it's the repository of veteran experience and tactical wisdom. For the Death Specters, the first company is called the Wargeists, and they carry power scythes, not power swords, not thunder hammers, power scythes. Long-hafted weapons designed for sweeping, reaping cuts that clear multiple opponents in a single arc, rather than engaging in the kind of single-target dueling that most Space Marine close combat weapons are optimized for. The choice of the scythe as a weapon is deeply symbolic in the context of a chapter defined by death and harvesting, but it's not purely symbolic. Against the kinds of enemies the Death Specters regularly face, things that come in large numbers, the things that swarm and overwhelm through mass rather than individual excellence, a weapon that can cut through multiple targets at once has genuine tactical value. The Wargeists are described as operating in Terminator armor in at least some contexts, combining the battlefield durability of the heaviest personal armor available to Space Marines with the sweeping range and lethality of their signature weapon. A Terminator in power scythe, wading through enemies and clearing space in wide arcs, is a nightmare for dense infantry formations and swarming Xenos alike. The name Wargeist is itself worth unpacking. A Geist in various Germanic and Northern European folklore traditions is a ghost, a spirit, or a specific kind of haunting presence. The Wargeists are not just elite soldiers. They are named as the spirits of war, was the ghosts of battle, entities that haunt the battlefield and cannot be ended the way ordinary things can be ended. Given that the Death Specter's initiation literally involves dying and returning, the veterans who make it to the Wargeists have died at least twice, possibly 3 or more times. They have been to whatever exists beyond death and come back. Calling them Geists is not just poetic, it's practically descriptive. The chapter maintains a Deathwatch presence as well, contributing warriors to the Ordo Xenos' specialist kill teams. This makes obvious sense, given their focus on Xenos threats and their accumulated knowledge of alien species that most chapters have never encountered. Sure, a Death Specter serving in the Deathwatch brings expertise in fighting things that other kill team members have only read about in intelligence reports, if those reports even exist. The Deathwatch novel's protagonist Leandro Carras is a Death Specter, and his value to Talon's squad is partly his general psychic ability and leadership, but it's also the specific, hard-won knowledge of what things from the Ghoul Stars are and how to kill them. When Carras operates in the Deathwatch, he functions as a center of gravity for the squad, a source of steady authority whose patience and calm in the face of death reads as almost inhuman to Marines from other chapters who haven't been through what he's been through. He's been dead more than once. The things Talon's squad encounters in their missions are frightening to warriors from other traditions. Or to Carras, Fear of death is something he processed and put aside years ago when he navigated the Black River and came back the first time. This doesn't make him cold or detached. It makes him precise, focused, reliable in exactly the way that someone who has already stared at the worst outcome and emerged from it is reliable. The Death Specters' relationship with the Inquisition is complicated and worth a brief note. They cooperate with the Death Watch, they assist in campaigns when they're needed, and they operate generally within the boundaries of loyal service to the Imperium. But the secret they're keeping, the Sharia, puts them in a fundamentally unusual position relative to the Inquisition. If the Inquisition ever found out about the Throne of Glass, is about a Xenos artifact of unknown origin and power that every chapter master of the Death Specters uses until it kills him, the response would not be measured or thoughtful. The Inquisition does not like unknown alien artifacts of enormous power, hidden under the personal fortress of a Space Marine chapter. The Death Specters know this and have maintained the secret for 7,000 years with the same steadiness they've maintained everything else. But the tension exists. It's a background pressure on everything the chapter does. Their watch station Damaroth, referenced in the Death Watch fiction, is described as being based around some form of Xenos technology, which is itself an irony worth noting for a chapter theoretically devoted to eliminating alien threats. The Ghoul Stars have apparently yielded artifacts beyond the Sharia that the Death Specters have found useful enough to appropriate, and the watch station serves as a hub for the kind of operations that require a permanent, heavily defended outpost beyond normal Imperial supply lines. It's described as being vastly larger and more heavily armed than a conventional watch station, which tells you something about the scale of what the Death Specters face when they're doing their job. In terms of colour scheme, the Death Specters' aesthetic is one of the most visually striking in the setting. Black armour, predominantly. A single white pauldron on the left shoulder, bone-coloured helmet. The company colour is indicated by a stripe on the right knee plate, and a small detail that distinguishes warriors from different companies without breaking the overall darkness of the colour scheme. The shoulder marking is their chapter symbol, that skull flanked by crossed scythes. When you see a group of Death Specters together, the visual impression is of warriors who have dressed deliberately to look like death itself, dark as void, pale as bone, carrying weapons that were invented to reap the dead. Notable campaigns and characters. The Death Specters have been involved in several notable campaigns across the 41st Millennium, though their operational preference for stealth and their remote posting means that their involvement is often noted more in implications and aftermath than in direct documentation. What records exist of their actions tend to be incomplete, and that incompleteness is itself revealing. A chapter whose entire purpose involves containing information as well as enemies has learned to leave small footprints. The Vern 4 offensive of 140 in the 40th Millennium put the Death Specters in conflict with both the Drukhari Cabal of the Envenomed Thorn and the Void Dragons, an Aeldari Corsair warband. The fact that the chapter was fighting both simultaneously says something about the kind of multi-front operations they're built for. The Drukhari and the Corsairs operating in the same area suggests a complex situation where multiple factions were exploiting the same territory, and the Death Specters were acting as the local Imperial authority against both of them. The Drukhari in particular are an interesting opponent for this chapter. The Dark Eldar, to use their older name, are master slavers who stage raids across the galaxy to capture victims for their nightmare city of Komorragh. Fighting them in the Ghoul Stars region means the Death Specters were potentially protecting the local human populations they also use as prime stock, which creates a certain complexity in the chapter's motivations. Those people are assets to be managed, but they're still human, and the Drukhari's interest in them as slaves represents a competing claim that the Death Specters would resist on purely functional grounds. The Makarian Crusade of 392 to 399 in the 41st Millennium drew the Death Specters away from their usual post and into one of the great Imperial military campaigns of the era. Lord Solar Macarius, widely considered the greatest Astra Militarum commander in Imperial history, led a 7-year crusade that reconquered approximately 1/3 1,000 worlds in the galactic west. The Death Specters participated. The fact that a chapter normally devoted entirely to the Ghoul Stars committed forces to an operation this far from home, in a completely different segmentum, suggests that the Makarian Crusade's scope and importance was sufficient to override the usual calculus of stationing, or perhaps that the Shariac's power was strong enough at that point that the chapter felt it could spare forces without compromising the Watch. The Makarian Crusade is notable in Imperial history, not just for its military scope, but for what happened after it ended. The empire Macarius had built didn't hold together after his death, fragmenting in the wars of apostasy that followed. The Death Specters' contribution to the early phase of that campaign was presumably made without any way to anticipate the subsequent chaos. The attempt to exterminate the Scythe or Fiends, which likely predated the Black Templars' Ghoul Stars crusade in 990 of the 41st Millennium, represents one of the most revealing moments in the chapter's documented history. The Death Specters apparently made their own assault on Gravecore, the Scythe or Fiends' homeworld, and found it empty then as well. The Scythe or Fiends were gone when the Death Specters arrived, exactly as they were gone when the Black Templars arrived later. When Captain Narush of the Death Specters watched the Black Templars try and fail to destroy Gravecore, his comment was that it didn't matter, that the Scythe or Fiends always came back. That statement is delivered in the tone of someone who is not surprised, someone who has seen this before, someone who has been chasing this particular enemy for a very long time, and has developed a weary certainty that conventional solutions won't work. The Ghoul Stars crusade itself, in 990 to 998 of the 41st Millennium, is worth examining in more detail because the Death Specters' role in it is illuminating. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars launched this crusade immediately upon achieving his rank, an aggressive opening move that stated clearly what kind of leader he intended to be. He took the Black Templars into territory that no previous Imperial expedition had returned from and fought for 8 years. By the end, the Scythe or Fiends' outlying systems were cleared, and the crusade reached Gravecore itself. The Death Specters contributed forces to this crusade, which is notable. The chapter that has been watching the Ghoul Stars for 7,000 years had clearly not managed to exterminate the Scythe or Fiends on its own. It's possible they weren't trying to. The Death Specters' mission is containment and vigilance, not necessarily elimination. They watch the border. They respond to threats as they emerge. The systematic crusade-scale clearance of an alien species isn't necessarily within their operational template, and the Scythe of Fiends' ability to apparently evacuate Gravecore before Imperial forces arrive suggests that elimination might not be achievable through conventional military means regardless. From Captain Narush's comment about the Scythe or Fiends always returning is the most explicitly ominous statement any Death Spectre makes in the available lore. It implies not just military resilience but something stranger. A species that consistently abandons its homeworld before Imperial forces arrive, whose homeworld resists exterminatus, that always returns to reclaim a world it had vacated, is operating on a different timeline and with different priorities than conventional enemies. The Death Specters know this. They've been watching long enough to see the pattern, and what that knowledge has produced in them, rather than despair or rage, is a patient, almost geological acceptance that this is simply how things are. As the operations against Hive Fleet Jormungandr, alongside the Honoured Sons in 995 of the 41st Millennium, placed the Death Specters in the unusual position of fighting Tyranids, an enemy that most Ghoul Stars specialists rarely encounter. The northeastern boundaries of the Imperium that this campaign covered overlap geographically with the Death Specters' patrol range, which suggests this was less a deployment decision by the High Lords, and more the Death Specters responding to a threat in their own backyard. The Tyranid splinter that passed through the region reportedly became disoriented and twisted before heading toward the Orask system, which is exactly the kind of anomalous Xenos behavior that the Ghoul Stars tend to produce. Something in the region affects the Tyranids' usual directional sense, which is itself interesting information about the nature of the Ghoul Stars as a region. The Death Specters' involvement in the 13th Black Crusade of approximately 999 in the 41st millennium, saw them deploy 6 full companies to the Cadian sector. Participating in the siege of Lelithar, they operated in a manner typical of their Raven Guard heritage, conducting guerrilla raids and stealth operations against Chaos forces to assist the Astra Militarum and the Legio Ignatum Titans fighting to retake the world. 6 companies is a significant commitment for a chapter that normally can't afford to leave its post weakly defended. The scale of the 13th Black Crusade apparently justified pulling that much force off the Ghoul Stars' watch. Or whether that decision was purely strategic, or whether the Magir's perception from the Sharia suggested that the threat elsewhere temporarily outweighed the risk of reduced vigilance at the border, is a question the law doesn't answer. In terms of named characters, Leandro Carras is the most fully developed figure in the Death Specters fiction. He serves as the protagonist of Steve Parker's Deathwatch novel and several associated short stories, and through his eyes, the reader gets the most intimate access available to what it actually feels like to be a Death Spectre. Carras is a first codicea, a senior librarian assigned to lead Talon Squad in the Deathwatch under the command of the shadowy Inquisitor Sigma. He carries the Archiman, the Force sword that Kadash laid at the Golden Throne, and he carries with it the weight of a prophecy that surrounds him, but that the chapter's leadership won't fully explain to him. What makes Carras interesting as a character is that his Death Spectre nature isn't just cosmetic. His calm in the face of death, his willingness to lead a squad of warriors from other chapters with a patience and steadiness that unsettles some of them, his specific relationship to mortality that comes from having died and returned more than once. All of these traits show up in how he operates. He doesn't fit into the Deathwatch template easily, not because he's abrasive or difficult in the way some of the other squad members are, but because his frame of reference is genuinely different. He has been somewhere they haven't. When the rest of Talon's squad is confronting things that frighten them, Carras is the steady center, and what grounds him isn't courage in the conventional sense, it's experience. He's already died. The worst outcome is familiar territory. The Archiman is worth its own moment of attention. A Force sword in 40K is already a remarkable weapon, a blade that channels psychic power to enhance its cutting ability and can channel the wielder's psychic attacks through the blade itself. The Archiman is additionally described as having a psychic spirit bound into it, a presence within the sword that melds with its wielder's own spirit and enhances their combat capabilities. But it's also the sword that was laid at the feet of the Golden Throne. Kadash placed it there, and in the same moment received the vision of the Shariax. Whatever the Emperor's presence did to, or communicated through that sword in the moment of the vision, the sword carries that moment with it. It has been in the chapter's possession for 7,000 years, passed from Mega to Chief Librarian to wherever it needs to be next. The fact that it was given to Carras, that the Messazar entrusted him with a relic of such extraordinary significance, is the clearest possible signal that the chapter's leadership believes he's important to whatever comes next. A Theocaudatus, referred to as the Messazar and Chief Librarian at a certain point in the chapter's history, was the de facto chapter master during the period when the Magyar was deep in the Shariac's slow claim, managing day-to-day chapter operations while the first Spectre maintained the throne's power. It was Caudatus who passed the Archiman to Carras, recognizing something in the younger librarian that led him to entrust the most sacred relic in the chapter's possession to him. Whether that recognition was about Carras's combat potential or about something more prophetically significant is left open. Captain Narush is the Death Specters officer documented participating in the Ghoul Stars crusade, alongside the Black Templars, the one who watched them fail to destroy Gravecore and said essentially that it wouldn't matter anyway. What we know of Narush from that brief interaction is of a warrior who has absorbed the chapter's deep patience so thoroughly that even the failure of an exterminatus action, the literal inability to destroy a world, doesn't particularly surprise or disturb him. He's been watching things not die for a long time. He's comfortable with it. Merin Kadash, the founding chapter master, deserves a final mention here because his story is in some ways the one that everything else in the Death Specters' history flows from. He was the first Magyar. He stood at the golden throne and received the vision. He led the chapter to Aludus and found the Shariax. He built Logopole above it. He made the prophecy of the Kadash and the great resurrection. And then he sat down on the throne and began his long, slow end, becoming the first stone statue in the Temple of Voices. Every chapter master who has come after him has followed exactly the path he opened. He set in motion a chain of sacrifice that has been running for 70 centuries. His sword, the Archiman, that he placed at the Emperor's feet before he ever knew what the Shariax was or what it would ask of him, has outlasted his flesh. It's still in the chapter's possession, still being used, still carrying whatever moment of connection it experienced in that chamber on Terra all those millennia ago, and now it rests with Leandro Carras, who may or may not be the Kadash, who may or may not be the one who finally sits the Shariax and brings about the great resurrection. Mysteries, theories, and what could come next. The Death Specters are defined by their unanswered questions, and those questions have been open long enough that the fan community has had years to theorize about them. Some of those theories are more grounded in specific textual evidence than others, but all of them reveal what makes this chapter such fertile ground for imaginative engagement with the setting. The mysteries aren't frustrating gaps in the lore, they're the lore. The withholding of answers is itself meaningful. When a setting this detailed chooses not to answer a question, it's usually because the question is load-bearing for something larger that the writers are still building. The most persistent and evocative theory concerns the relationship between the Shariax and the Golden Throne. The parallels between the two artifacts are, as we've discussed, impossible to ignore. Both drain the life of their occupants while generating enormous psychic power. Both are surrounded by secrecy maintained by those closest to them. Both are central to the operation of some kind of barrier or ward against forces that would otherwise break through. The Shariax is described as feeling to psychers in orbit like a vast pressure, and the Golden Throne's psychic output is on a different order of magnitude, but in a similar register. If the two are connected, if the Shariax is in some way a node in the same network as the Golden Throne, then the Death Specters' vigil over the Ghoul Stars takes on cosmological dimensions. They wouldn't just be one chapter guarding one border. They would be a critical component of whatever system the Emperor built to contain or manage the forces that press against the human galaxy from all directions. The fact that the Emperor showed Kadash where to find the Shariax, that the vision came directly from the Golden Throne, what adds weight to this theory. The Emperor knew where the Shariax was. He'd presumably known for a long time. He chose the founding of this specific chapter to reveal its location and to send warriors to its side. Why that timing? Why the dark founding specifically? The pale wasting suggests an answer. Something got through that shouldn't have. Something came out of the Ghoul Stars and destroyed 11 Space Marine chapters before being stopped. Whatever system had been in place before, whatever was managing the Ghoul Stars threat previously, had clearly failed or been insufficient. The 13th founding was the Emperor's correction to that failure, made at a moment when his ability to directly influence events in the material world was already severely limited by the demands of sustaining the Astronomicon. He couldn't do this himself. He sent someone else to do it. He told them where to go and what to sit on. The second major question, perhaps the most urgently interesting one, is the Kadash, the living chalice, the specific individual who, according to the Death Specters' deepest prophecy, will take their place on the Shariax and bring about the great resurrection. The implication in the Death Watch fiction is that Leandro Carras might be this person, or at minimum that he's close to the center of the prophesied events. The Archiman chose him. The Messazar chose him. The prophecy shadows him in ways that the chapter's leadership is clearly aware of and deliberately not explaining to him, which is a specific kind of manipulation that has its own moral weight. But if the great resurrection is what it sounds like, an actual resurrection of something that has died, which what precisely is being brought back? The Emperor is the obvious answer in a certain cosmic logic. The Emperor on the Golden Throne is not alive in any full sense, and not dead in any final sense. He is sustained, maintained, existing in a twilight state that the Imperium describes as divine, but that the more cynical elements of even its own institutions acknowledge is functionally a kind of endless dying. If the Sharia is connected to the Golden Throne, if the Death Specters have been managing a piece of the same system for 7,000 years, perhaps what the Great Resurrection refers to is the Emperor actually coming back, truly coming back. There are compelling reasons to find this theory attractive and compelling reasons to find it terrifying, as in a setting where the Emperor returning as a full being rather than a psychic ghost sustained by prayer would necessarily change the entire balance of power. The question of what that change looks like is not comfortably predictable. The Emperor before the heresy was a being with his own agenda, his own methods, and his own willingness to make decisions that most of his servants would have considered unconscionable. The new model army, the dismantling of the imperial religious cult, the deals made with entities from the warp that he never disclosed to anyone. A fully returned emperor might not be the salvation the Imperium imagines. He might have decided that the Imperium, after 10,000 years of drift and corruption and religious fanaticism in his name, is not worth saving in its current form. The Great Resurrection, as if it means what the name suggests, might be a beginning rather than an end, and beginnings often require clearing the ground first. The third question, and the most practically immediate one, concerns the Ghoul Stars themselves. The Pale Wasting destroyed 11 chapters before being stopped. The chronicles of the participants are empty. The records were censored. Whatever unmaking was done to the Wasting was done so thoroughly that even the Nova Marines, who are credited with doing it, won't speak of what they unmade. That kind of thorough suppression of a major historical event is unusual even by Imperial standards. It suggests the information itself is considered dangerous, that knowing what came out of the Ghoul Stars, knowing what it actually was, carries some risk of letting it back in, which means the Death Specters, positioned at the border, knowing what they know, watching what they watch, are maintaining a wall between the galaxy and something that doesn't have a name anyone is allowed to speak. That's a remarkable position for any entity to occupy. It's a position that, in narrative terms, is a loaded weapon pointing at the future. Whatever comes through that border, whenever it comes, the Death Specters will be the first responders. And given the evidence of what the Ghoul Stars have produced before, first responder is not a comfortable role to occupy. The question of what the Pale Wasting actually was also intersects with the question of the Thexian trade empire, a species mentioned in connection with the Ghoul Stars. The Thexians are a biomorphic species from worlds in the Ghoul Stars called the Blood Moons of Thex Prime, but they are known as masters of manipulation, capable of working themselves into integral positions within other civilizations. They have done this with the Borlak, the Loxatl, and the Nikasar, 3 other alien species. They are persuasive enough to direct the actions of entirely separate alien cultures, and when persuasion fails, their combat form is described as horrifying enough to serve as backup. Whether the Thexians are the Pale Wasting, whether they were a component of it, or whether they are simply one more threat among many in the Ghoul Stars, is never definitively stated. The Death Specters know. They've been watching long enough to know, but they're not saying. The Chrysos-Mortug connection adds a further thread of speculation. Mortug, the Loyalist Death Guard Psyker, who survived Istvan III and was eventually stationed at Aludus, was last recorded there before the Death Specters arrived. His fate is unknown, but Mortug was a powerful Psyker, was stationed on the world where the Shariaks waited in the dark, had a history of refusing to die in situations that should have killed him, and disappeared from the record precisely during the period when the Death Specters were founded and claimed Aludus as their own. The speculation that Mortug found the Shariaks first, that his presence on Aludus for decades before the chapter arrived might have left some imprint on either the world or the artifact, is one of those threads that could go in any number of directions if a writer ever decided to pull it. Mortug's specific history has its own resonances with the Death Specters culture. He was a Psyker who survived Istvan III, where almost no one survived, through a combination of fortitude and arguably willpower that stretched beyond the boundaries of what should have been biologically possible. He spent years afterward pursuing a mission that every reasonable assessment suggested was suicidal. He was stationed alone at the edge of the Ghoul Stars, keeping watch over something he may not have fully understood. He was a man defined by refusing to die when everything said he should have. The Death Specters are a chapter defined by exactly that quality. Whether that's coincidence or whether Morturg's connection to Aludus is meaningful in a way the lore hasn't yet explored, the parallel exists. Yet the Dark Founding's mystery itself is a question that bleeds into every element of the Death Specters' story. No gene seed samples are preserved on Terra. No records of how many chapters were created exist. The two known chapters from this founding, the Death Specters and the Exorcists, are both highly unusual, both operating under secret mandates, both with deeply anomalous practices that the broader Imperium would find alarming if it fully understood them. The Exorcists survive demonic possession as part of their initiation. The Death Specters serve a Xenos artifact that kills their leaders. Both are undeniably loyal. Both are undeniably doing something that falls well outside normal Imperial practice. Sam, the implication is that the Dark Founding was specifically intended to create chapters capable of doing things that the Adeptus Astartes, as officially constituted and regulated, shouldn't be doing. That the High Lords, or someone with authority above the High Lords at that moment in history, decided that certain problems required solutions that couldn't be sanctioned publicly. The Death Specters were one of those solutions. There's also the matter of the Era Indomitus, the period following the Great Rift's opening, when Rabuta Guilliman returned and launched the Indomitus Crusade to stabilize a fractured Imperium. The Primaris Marines that Guilliman introduced, created over 10,000 years in secret by Belisarius Cawl, using the gene seed of all the loyal Primarchs, are now available to all loyal chapters. The Death Specters presumably received a Primaris supplement along with everyone else. What does it mean for a chapter whose initiation involves dying and coming back, whose culture is built around the lived experience of multiple deaths, to receive warriors who were created through a different process entirely and have never navigated the Black River? That's a question with no current answer in the lore, but it's one that speaks to the tension between the Death Specters as they've always been and the broader changes transforming the Adeptus Astartes. What remains to be determined, and this is the question that the Death Specters' lore ultimately hangs on, is whether the preparation the chapter has been making for 7,000 years is about to reach its fulfillment. The Great Rift has opened, and the Imperium of the 42nd Millennium is under pressure on scales it has never faced before. The Ghoul Stars sit in the galactic northeast, and the Great Rift's opening has disrupted navigational and psychic systems across all of known space. If there was ever a time when something from the Ghoul Stars would make another push, when the pale wasting might try to happen again, it would be now, in the chaos of a shattered galaxy. And if there was ever a time when the Kadash would be needed, when the living chalice who will bring about the great resurrection would need to take their place on the Sharia, it would also be now. The Death Specters have been waiting for 7,000 years. They know how to be patient, but even they can feel the weight of this moment pressing against their watch. The final reflections. Why the Death Specters matter in a setting as vast and detailed as Warhammer 40,000. It would be easy for a chapter like the Death Specters to slip through the cracks. They don't have a Primarch-level character driving their lore forward. They don't have dozens of novels dedicated to exploring their history. They're mentioned in codex entries, featured in one dedicated novel, and a handful of short stories, and alluded to in the broader lore of the Ghoul Stars and the Dark Founding in ways that require active attention to notice. By the measures that usually determine a faction's prominence in the setting, they're minor. But that's precisely wrong as a way of thinking about them. The Death Specters are minor in terms of media attention and major in terms of what they represent and what they suggest. What they are a chapter that asks the hardest questions the setting offers. What is the cost of eternal vigilance? What is the relationship between service and sacrifice, when the sacrifice isn't a single dramatic moment, but an endless slow-motion giving of everything? What does it mean to build a culture, a theology, a way of life, around the understanding that death is a door rather than a wall, the image at the heart of their lore, a warrior king sitting on a throne of glass, slowly turning to stone, sustaining with his dying body a power that holds back the dark, is one of the most haunting images in the entire setting. It's not a glorious death. It's not the kind of end that gets you a monument in the great halls where heroes are remembered. You sit down, you never get up, you become rock, and the next one sits down after you, Arshi knowing exactly what's coming, and he doesn't flinch either. That's what faith looks like when it's not just decoration. That's what loyalty means when it's extended across 7,000 years. Not a gesture, not a ceremony. A continuous, active, costly choice made again and again by every chapter master who has ever taken the Magir's oath. Every single one of them made the same calculation and came to the same conclusion. This is worth it. My life, my slow dissolution, my eventual return to stone, all of it is worth whatever the Sharia makes possible. The Death Specters also remind us how much of the 41st millennium is shadow. Most of what happens in the Imperium's history is not recorded, or is recorded and then destroyed, or is recorded and then classified so deeply that the classification effectively destroys it. But the Pale Wasting's records were censored, the Dark Founding's records don't exist, the Shariac's existence is hidden from the Inquisition. The chapter's deepest secrets, the ones that the Magir apparently understands from his perch on the throne of glass, are known only to the warriors who have already given their lives in the service of knowing them. There is something going on out there, at the edge of the galaxy, that the rest of the Imperium doesn't know about, has never known about, has been deliberately kept from knowing about by the people most qualified to understand it. The Death Specters stand between the galaxy and that thing, and they have stood there for 70 centuries, and they will stand there until the Kadash comes and the great resurrection happens, and the plan that the Emperor set in motion before his own ascension to the throne reaches its completion, or until the Pale Wasting comes again, and the door doesn't hold, whichever comes first. The 42nd millennium is already here in the lore, the Great Rift is open, Gilliman has returned. The Indomitus Crusade is fighting its way across a shattered galaxy, trying to hold the pieces together long enough for something to change. Somewhere in the galactic northeast, past the last recognizable star patterns, past the quiet worlds that serve as the Death Specters' recruitment grounds and supply network, the Ghoul Stars are still there. The Scythor Fiends are still out there somewhere, waiting to come back to Gravecore. The flayed ones still prowl the bone-built corridors of Drazak. The things that don't have names are still in the dark between stars that shouldn't be the shapes they are. And the Death Specters are still watching, one set of pale eyes after another, scanning the dark with blood-red irises, in black armor that's been repainted over the damage of 1,000 campaigns, waiting for the thing that can't die to make its next move, waiting for the Kadash to arrive, waiting for the great resurrection to come, waiting with the patience of a chapter that has spent its entire existence understanding that some things only happen once, and that you'd better be ready when they do. The chapter has earned a story worthy of all of this. The lore they've been given has the bones of something extraordinary. The Dark Founding, the Cemetery World, the Throne of Glass, the Dying Chapter Masters, the Prophecy, the Three Deaths, the Wargeists with their scythes, the ancient sword laid at the Emperor's feet, the Black River, the Living Chalice. These are not random details. They connect, they suggest, they point towards something that has been building for the entire span of the chapter's existence. Whenever that story gets told, in full, it's going to be worth the wait. If you made it to the end of this, thank you, genuinely. The Death Specters are one of those corners of the lore that rewards the attention you bring to them. The more carefully you look, the more you find. The more threads you pull, the more they connect to things you didn't expect them to connect to. Steve Parker gave us a real gift with the Death Watch novel and its associated fiction. And one of the things the lore needs more of is exactly what he did. Writers willing to go deep on a lesser-known chapter and commit to the complexity. If you found this video and you're new here, This is what we do on this channel. We go deep on the strange, quiet, overlooked corners of the 41st millennium. We take our time with the lore, and we don't rush past the good parts. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe, and you'll know when the next one drops. If you've been here a while, you already know what this channel is about. Thanks for watching. Stay in the dark, keep the vigil, and remember, death is a door, not a wall. See you next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.